You ever sit down to watch a cute family-friendly Disney movie expecting to have a wonderful time but end up emotionally destroyed and having kind of a crisis? No, but are you in the market for a movie like that? Because if you are, boy do I got a film for you. Hi, my name is Hanahaki, but my friends call me Han, so you can call me that too. And I just noticed I'm dressed like a cartoon character, giving very much Todd from BoJack Horseman if his beanie was black instead of yellow, or that girl from Recess. I'm aware I look like a cartoon character. My hair was just not cooperating today, so this is what you're gonna get. But anyway, I recently watched Encanto, and I really liked the movie. Genuinely believe it's nothing like the other Disney movies I've watched in the past, and so I decided that today I'm gonna make a video analyzing exactly why I think so. Now, before I begin my analysis, two quick disclaimers. One, I'm not Colombian, so I deeply apologize if I end up mispronouncing something or missing out a deeper cultural element, which I'm sure I have done. I did try to make sure that most of my sources in this video are from people who are Colombian, as much as I could do, either through their TikTok platforms or from opinion pieces that Colombian people have written about Encanto. I really hope that comes through in what I present for this video. And my second disclaimer is that this video is full of spoilers. Like, it has so many spoilers, and I also kind of assume that you have at least a base knowledge of the movie. So if you haven't watched it, I highly encourage that you go watch the movie and then come back here. Don't worry, I'll be here. I'm not going anywhere. And if you've already watched the movie, then let's go forward. So Encanto tells the story of the family Madrigal, who live in a town called Encanto, and they kind of play the role of like the village or town chiefs by helping the people of the village with their problems. Now, the Madrigal family is made up of 3 different generations of Madrigals, and they all live in the house called Casita. The Casita is kind of like the unspoken other member of their family. It's sort of alive. It's able to produce new rooms every time one of the family members is bestowed with gifts, and those rooms tend to kind of reflect the kind of gift that the family member has, and like a safe space for them, I guess the best way I can say it. And Casita also gives off very much smart home vibes, except with all the benefits and some more magical elements and none of the creepy spying, possible hacking potential that smart homes kind of give off. Now, every time a family member turns 5, the matriarch of the family, Abuela, leads them into the process of them getting their gifts, where basically they touch a door that Casita's made for them, they touch the family's central candle, which is a very important part of the family, and then they're able to get their gift. So this is like a huge procession, the entire town comes from it, and our main protagonist, Mirabel, during this procession never got her gift, so she's the only biological Madrigal who does not have a gift. Now, the central conflict of the story is that Mirabel notices that there's problems happening, like the Casita is developing cracks and not functioning as smoothly as it usually does, and that the other members of the Madrigal family are losing their powers, or their powers are weakening. So in an effort to put a stop to this, find out what is happening, she goes out in search of the family member with the power to look into the future in order to see more answers, and also because one of the family members, I don't remember who right now, tells her that this family member made a prediction about this happening, and so Mirabel assumes that, hey, maybe I can learn more about the situation if I go and speak to this family member. Now, here's the catch. That family member is estranged. They don't know where he is, and his name is Bruno. From the super famous, absolute banger, We Don't Talk About Bruno, no. I did not sing that in tune. I think Encanto handles a very mature topic in a very much direct manner, which I don't think a lot of Disney movies do. To be fair, there are mature themes that do get discussed in Disney movies through metaphors or insinuation, but I think a lot of times they're not done in the clear-cut manner that in Encanto they're done. I will make an exception for one movie though. I think Coco also tells a similar tale, but takes a different path to do so. But yes, Encanto definitely tells a much more mature tale. It's still in that fun, typical Disney way with the guaranteed happy ending. So the theme that is displayed in Encanto is intergenerational trauma. If you don't know what that means, I will go over it in just a bit, but it is important to note that the events of the movie happen, I think, 40 years after the general central trauma that occurred to one of the family members and then spread to the other family members, kind of like like in a ripple effect. It also seems like the movie is taking place in the mid-20th century, which explains the character designs, why there's no technology, but at the same time, why the town is a certain way. There's also some speculation that the massive trauma event that Abuela Alma experienced was the 1,000-Day War, which is one of the deadliest and most destructive civil wars that happened in Colombia that went on from 17 October 1889 until 21st November 1902 and led to a loss of 2% of the country's population. And while it does not seem like a lot, that's about 150,000 people. That's a huge number. It was basically a civil war between the conservative and the liberal party of the country and trying to decide in what direction the economy went in. But during the 1,000-Day War, a lot of people were forced to abandon their houses, families were separated, and I did see some articles saying that the effects of it are still seen today and that it's deeply ingrained into the lives and the historical stories of people from Colombia. So some people escaped within their country and other people left their country. Disney, I think in an effort to make sure that the movie is more translatable for all of Colombia, did not really pinpoint a certain location that Encanto is in, but we can predict that Encanto probably formed when Abuela Alma and the other people of her original town had to escape. Now, this is not the first time Disney has explored trauma. Trauma has been explored through other characters too, like Bambi, Lilo and Stitch, Pinocchio, Mulan, and through the many different emotions as characters from Inside Out and in other characters. But I think the different way in which trauma is portrayed in Encanto is what makes it stand out here, because usually in my experience, whenever trauma is shown in a Disney movie, it seems to be from a more individualistic perspective, that is through one person. Even in Inside Out, where we had multiple different characters experiencing the same trauma, it was within the head of one person, and usually we don't get to see the shared pain that trauma can lead through in families or across multiple characters. So I think it was very interesting to see that and how well Disney depicted it. And that brings us to chapter 2, Understanding Trauma. Massive trigger warning, this goes over some disturbing facts like the Holocaust, mental health issues, possible mentions of and genocide in other countries too, so if you're not comfortable with that, I highly recommend you skip to this timestamp, but if you're okay with that, keep listening. Now, to really understand how this movie explores trauma and how it does that differently, we need to understand the main kind of trauma that these characters experienced. I did mention it earlier, and it is called transgenerational trauma or intergenerational trauma. It was first documented in 1966 by Canadian psychiatrist Vivian M. Rakoff. Her and her colleagues noticed high amounts of psychological distress among children of Holocaust survivors, and they also found that a really high number of them seeked out mental help at clinics in Canada. In fact, and now I'm going to read this fact to make sure I get it right. Among the number of referrals made to psychiatric clinics, grandchildren of Holocaust survivors were overrepresented by 300% relative to the general population. That's a massive number. 300% is not a small figure. And now, since 1966, a lot of researchers have noticed unusually high amounts of anxiety, depression, and PTSD in both trauma survivors, their children, and their grandchildren. The primary group that this was researched in was Holocaust trauma survivors and their progeny. Yael Danieli, co-founder, director, and senior psychotherapist of Group Project of Holocaust Survivors in New York and Treatment of Multi-Generational Legacies of Trauma, which, oh my god, she just has done so much, wrote that she noticed 3 main adaptive styles happening the most in Holocaust survivors. The first adaptive style is called victim style, which is when people who have difficulty moving on from the original trauma end up becoming emotionally volatile and overprotective. The second adaptive style is numb style. Numb adaptive style is when people cope with the original trauma by becoming emotionally detached, intolerant of weakness, and keeping a conspiracy of silence within the family, which basically means that within the family they have this agreement that 1, we will not talk about the trauma never happened, and no one must bring it up. Because that's 2 things. Maybe 3. I can do math. The third adaptive style is fighter style. Fighter style focuses on maintaining the original identity that was being oppressed or caused the trauma in the first place, and people undergoing this adaptive style usually champion justice and mastery. The adaptive style the trauma survivor ends up developing is dependent on factors such as the gender of the trauma survivor, the number of children the trauma survivor ends up having, and specifically in the case of Holocaust survivors, whether or not they were able to seek refuge, escape from, or hide during the duration of their trauma, and whether or not the survivor was able to go to Israel, where they received community support and were able to share the burden of the incredibly cruel acts that they were forced to live through. And they were able to regain the strength and confidence in their persecuted identity. refugees. Additionally, in the case of general refugee seekers who were moving to countries in North America, the adaptive style that they developed is also dependent on how they were treated as refugees, the kind of refugee struggles that they experienced, and the strategies that they developed to cope with those. Even the intensity of the adaptive style that is developed is dependent on the factors I mentioned before. Now, Daniele also noticed a specific pattern of behavior among children of Holocaust survivors, including taking an overly protective stance towards their parents, having a high need for control, an obsession with the Holocaust, and immature dependencies. Now, she called these reactions, and I will be quoting, reparative adaptational impacts, and explained that these were methods that the survivors' progeny developed in order to try to repair the world and the experience of the world for their parents, their grandparents, and even themselves, especially after they had to go through something incredibly traumatic. Honestly, I feel like this part, I just felt so much sympathy and empathy for the people going through this. I think it is incredibly human and also deeply moving that they develop these mechanisms to just repair the world and make it a better place for people they loved. Honestly, that's very heartwarming. Now, the effects of these studies, the behavior that these studies have uncovered, and just intergenerational trauma is not specific to Holocaust survivors and their progeny. It's just that they're one of the most researched groups when it comes to intergenerational trauma, and I think it's because most of the conversations happening about this have been very specific to certain countries where certain populations were prioritized over other. And by saying that, I'm not at all taking away from the incredible amounts of anti-Semitism that exists in these countries and the terrible experience that Jewish people have to go through because of that. I'm just saying that the research so far has been conducted from a perspective very much specific to Holocaust survivors. Now, researchers who study the indigenous populations of North America, specifically United States and Canada and not Mexico, found similar effects among the grandchildren, the children, and the general survivors of the massive cultural oppression that these indigenous populations experienced. Psychologist Amy Bombay, an assistant professor at Dalhousie University in Canada, studied the intergenerational effects of Indian residential schools. Indian residential schools were basically these institutions that were run by the American and the Canadian governments that focused on forcefully assimilating Native children into the culture and the religion of their oppressors, while also erasing their identities by teaching them to be ashamed of their identities, cultural practices, traditions, and language. Just to be clear, these Indian residential schools ran from the late 1800s to as recent as 1990s. I think the last one closed in 1995 if I'm not wrong, and we're still even seeing the effects of the terrible things that happened to those children that attended these schools today. These places were awful and they caused so much trauma for multiple generations of indigenous people to North America. Now, and I will be reading this out because the name's really long, the First Nations Regional Longitudinal Health Survey and the Aboriginal Peoples Survey found that children and even grandchildren of those who attended residential schools were more likely to report psychological distress, suicide attempts, and contracting hepatitis C from shared drug use, compared to the children and grandchildren of those who did not attend these residential schools. Now, like I said before, these horrible traumas and the effects and the survival mechanisms people learned from them are not only specific to Holocaust survivors or even the indigenous people of North America. Studies have also found similar reports in the African American descendants of enslaved people, in the descendants of those affected by the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, the Rwandan genocide, those who were able to survive Holodomor, which is the massive starvation of millions of Soviet Ukrainians that was apparently facilitated by Joseph Stalin, according to the research I found, and many other terrible events. Now, because we're all human beings going through these, massive traumas affect us in similar ways. They also affect populations in multidimensional ways across different generations. And to be clear, this field is still very young and has not been conducted across many diverse and different populations. In the studies we do have, we are already seeing patterns in the way the pain of our own ancestors is so embedded into our biology and the way we function. Now, to bring it back to Encanto, I wasn't able to find research specifically about the trauma survivors of the Thousand Day War or even their descendants, mostly because I think it is an under-researched area, but because these patterns are similarly occurring in survivors of massive traumas, we can use the previous research as a basis when we look at the Madrigal family and why they are the way they are. Okay, because all of that stuff was super heavy, here's a little clip of Luisa doing a body roll, and can we just talk about how she would absolutely kill it as a TikToker? Also, here's a fun little tidbit, I recently learned that for the dances in Encanto, they actually hired a Colombian choreographer or someone who's of Colombian descent to help make sure that they had like a little bit of like the facial movement and like the cultural body gestures down. I think I saw like a TikTok of someone talking about like how they noticed particular moves that a character did being similar to what they and their family who are Colombian do. That was really cool. And also the fact that I think most of the voice actors are Colombian or are of Colombian descent, which is also really cool that they kept the essence of the movie so true to the country that it's based in. And also the diversity in the movie. It's super cool how they made sure to include people of all races just because Colombia's genetic makeup is so mixed. Because I noticed in depictions of Latin America, you don't really get to see the true diversity that countries hold. So that was actually quite cool. Now, chapter 3. Now let's finally go back to the actual theme of this video. Let's talk about trauma at Casita. That kind of sounds like a show. Now let's start this conversation with where the trauma actually truly starts in the Madrigal family, at Abuela Alma. Alma is the matriarch of the Madrigal family. She's focused, determined, resilient. When we first meet her, she's giving young 5-year-old Mirabel a pep talk about her gift receiving ceremony, which we know she won't actually get a gift. But she's giving her a pep talk about this, and during this conversation, we can see a foreshadowing into Abuela Alma's approach to life and approach to the gifts that they all receive. Now, I will be quoting exactly what she says during this scene. Tonight, this candle will give you a gift, mi vida. Strengthen our community, strengthen our home, make your family proud. And I think this really highlights her motivation and the way she thinks about the gift they've been giving and the function of it within the family. Now, I've noticed that a lot of people in the discourse around Encanto come away from this movie thinking that Abuela Alma is the villain and her only function is to serve as the abuser and the creator of the conflict in the film. And while I understand where this thought process is developing from, I think it's very important to look at Abuela Alma from the perspective of trauma and her experience of trauma. Now, during the absolutely beautiful song Dos Orguitas that gets me crying every single time I hear it, like my god, these waterworks do not stop. It is basically Niagara Falls up here when I'm listening to the song. We learn about Abuela Alma's backstory when she met her late husband, Pedro. Both of them were young, full of hopes and dreams, and in a completely different town. I actually went through a translation of Dos Orguitas because my Spanish is god-awful, and noticed that even within the lyrics, they describe what happened to the couple. So Dos Orguitas means 2 caterpillars, and they use the metaphor of caterpillars and what's happening with them, and the cocooning, and then turning into butterflies to explain how Abuela Alma fell into this role in the first place, and how she lost her husband. For example, the lyrics here tell us about how they're living through a world that's rapidly changing because of the historical event that we're assuming to be the 1,000-day war happening. And then the song even mentions that they must grow apart, and in return they must leave and build their own futures. I think that part is more focused on Abuela Alma than Abuelo Pedro. Pedro mostly because, you know, he dead. The saddest verse in the song even states that the 2 caterpillars are disoriented and must do whatever necessary to be able to survive in a world that is rapidly changing. And later, when they transform into a butterfly, they must fly and find their own future when one of the caterpillar dies. Now, having this song play and this metaphor being spoken about as a backdrop to Abuela Alma's story is so impactful because we're able to understand her feelings not just through her expressions, but through the song. I think it's truly sad how the song even continues to play when we see Abuelo Pedro and Abuela Alma leading the people of their town outside the town and in search for another place to go. That one of the militant groups terrorizing the Colombian people during the 1,000-day war finds them, and Abuelo Pedro must give himself up and sacrifice himself for the safety of everyone else. And Abuela Alma has to see that happen while she has her 3 children in her arms. She has to see him get brutally murdered and then has to take control of the entire group, find a place for them to go, and kind of serve as a leader of these people. And I think that's why in the scene where she watches her husband die and she cries out and then the magic sort of appears through the candle, I think the candle in this situation serves as a metaphor. Keep her family together and keep everyone safe. That is developed from that point in time when she sees something terrible happen and learns that she must do all these things if she wants the people she loves and herself to survive, so she doesn't have to go through such a terrible thing again. And so here I think we see her begin to develop one of the adaptive styles I mentioned before, numb style, where the people don't talk about the trauma they experienced, they become emotionally detached, and there's a conspiracy of silence in the family. family, which is why we see that none of the generations of Madrigal really talk about the terrible way Abuela Alma lost her husband. And this is why I think Abuela Alma takes up a non-adaptive style and kind of starts approaching the world with a very much survivalist attitude, even when she doesn't have to be that way. That is when the Thousand-Day War has ended, when there's more peace and conflict has ended in Colombia. And we see this in the way that she treats every member of her family too, how she prioritizes the gifts, which in her eyes are survival mechanisms and ways that she can continue her goal of protection, survival, and community safety, and strengthening the community too. And while these survival mechanisms and this way of approaching the world worked fantastic in the past when the stimulus of these adaptive mechanisms was present, now when it's absent, they're kind of doing the opposite and failing her. And we can see this in the way that she just doesn't understand how to respond to Mirabel. And Mirabel goes and finds her doing Antonio's gift ceremony to tell her that Casita's cracking down. Or when we've seen in the way she expects Isabel to be perfect at all times, expects the other members of the family to always fulfill their roles, and doesn't understand how to cope with a negative presentation of Bruno's power, and so instead kind of creates a situation where he gets ostracized from the family and no one talks about him anymore. So as a result, the Casita begins to grow weaker because the survival mechanism is weakening the bonds of the family. And in my head, I kind of see Casita as like a symbol for family bonds. And so the candle, the depiction of her drive, begins to burn out. So to talk about how trauma manifests in the other members of the family, I will be looking different, for some excitement and not because my camera's about to die. All right. Ta-da! It's me, just with not crunchy hair anymore. Now let's go right back to talking about trauma in the members of the Madrigal family. Specifically, let's go to the generation after Abuela Alma. That is to her kids, the triplets who were alive when their father passed away. So that's Julieta, Bruno, and Pepe. Hi, I just realized I've been calling Pepa Pepe this whole time. So let's pretend like I'm not saying Pepe and that I'm saying Pepa, because this is really embarrassing. Why would she be called Pepe? Anyway, returning to the video. Now, Julieta, the oldest triplet and our protagonist's mother, possesses the gift of being able to heal people through her food. She cooks the food, the person consumes it, and bam, they're a-okay. Now, while her character isn't really explored much outside of being Mirabel's mother, we're able to see hints of how her own mother's trauma has affected her. For example, during an argument between Abuela and Mirabel about the state of Casita, specifically Mirabel saying that Casita is falling apart or beginning to show cracks, Julieta, while concerned, remains silent, choosing to be neutral instead of supporting her daughter. And when we do see Julieta kind of confront her mother, it's usually when other people are not around her and it's just her and her mom. Also, I think her powers can serve as a metaphor for how she attempts to heal others through acts of physical service, like cooking, which perhaps can allude to the fact that she had to grow up really fast and take over more of the grown-up roles of the family, such as cooking for the other members of her family. Sometimes in families where massive trauma has occurred and there's only one parent, the oldest kid ends up stepping in and taking a more mature role to help raise their siblings. So I think Julieta's powers might suggest that she had to take that role in her family. I'm also mostly saying this since she's the only character we can see who actually cooks. There are times when the other Madrigal members do help setting the table and putting dishes down and stuff, but we never see any of them actively cooking, at least not to my knowledge, except for Julieta. And so her trauma might manifest in terms of her having to take on a parental role to her other siblings. Now, before we go to everyone's favorite Theo, Bruno, let's talk about Pepe, the youngest of the triplets. Now, Pepe possesses the gifts to manipulate the weather based on her emotions, and I think she's a very interesting character because her gifts are the most tangible in relation to what she's feeling, and so we can almost see her trauma and the burden of her trauma manifest very physically through her gifts. And as like a little weather cloud right above her head, she almost seems to be constantly forced to emotionally regulate for others in order to maintain the weather or the temperament and the peace within the family. And so we see her being forced to emotionally regulate, that is, reel in her emotions when other members of the family kind of chastise her for making the weather a particular way, or in other words, kind of stirring up the family or breaking the whole pleasant facade that the entire family is forced to wear. Her need to control her own mood, have to constantly force the weather to be pleasant, that is, have the physical presentation of being a-okay at all times, is a trauma response of her having to kind of swallow her emotions down and make sure that her family's emotions are prioritized over her own, which is why the only time we see anyone defending her about her weather conditions, trying to be there for her, is when her husband does it. And I think even her kids, but we never see like the other members of the family try to do it. Specifically not Abuela. Multiple times Abuela Alma actually tells her to calm down or to get the weather to be okay. And we can see that she's a very anxious person. Her moods shift very rapidly, which causes the weather to shift very rapidly too, which can also be a sign that she's not completely in touch with her emotions or completely able to process her emotions because of how quickly she's forced to swallow them down. Also, just a little extra note, I feel like she's one of the only members who was genuinely wronged by Bruno, but I feel as though when the other members were upset with Bruno, it was like not really his fault because he was just predicting the future as they'd asked him to. But Pepe, I feel like she genuinely did not ask him to predict her future and like to say anything about the weather during her wedding, and then he did, and then that made her get anxious and triggered a hurricane. And in doing so, he floods her brain, and so Abuela had to get the umbrella. It's so hard not to sing We Don't Talk About Bruno. That song is such a banger. Anyway, let's move on to everyone's favorite Tio, Bruno. So Bruno's the middle kid and also the first hurdle that Abuela Alma faces after she sets up Casita and Encanto. His ability to prophesize kind of violates the very strict mold Abuela Alma keeps the family functioning in because it forces her, a person who is using numb strategy, to break her conspiracy of silence. Because when Bruno predicts things, a lot of times they can be negative, and then the family members have to talk about those negative things. So it's not necessarily her trauma that's being discussed, but it could potentially be things that are the result of her trauma and might even lead to certain weaknesses. That means more emotional things to come out because family members are forced to discuss them. People in the town are forced to discuss them because Bruno prophesizes about something possibly happening to them. And his gift also demands for these emotions that might come out to be addressed. And so secrets might get spilled, family cracks might potentially get noticed. Just basically everything that Abuela Alma probably does not want out in the open or that violates her need to maintain strength and security within the family and therefore within Encanto. Like a hushed family secret when he prophesizes about Casita, acting here almost as a symbol for his family, beginning to show cracks and potentially having to break apart because of Mirabel. Instead of addressing this issue and trying to figure out what it could potentially mean, Abuela Alma discards her son and stops treating Mirabel very well. Abuela maintains her survival instinct of powering through, ignoring danger, and instead continuing to survive in the only way she knows how to. Now, I've also seen some discussion about Bruno potentially signifying a neurodivergent family member who displays overt signs of their potential mental illness, or just a family member who thinks very differently from the rest of their family. And I feel like if we're going with that theory, then that condition still greatly violates the way Abuela Alma functions and how she wants her family to function. Also, Bruno's gift is the only one that cannot be controlled to be positive because, as we see in the movie, he can't really control what he sees and he can't even fully understand them. He just sees them. And I think a pattern that we're noticing as we go through the family members is Abuela Alma likes the gifts that she's able to control by telling the member how to wield it. So when she's not able to do that for Bruno, especially because his gift possibly has negative consequences, he's cast aside. It's almost like a warning to the other family members that if you can't follow us, you have to leave us. And he's a very first sign and almost a foreshadowing that Abuela Alma's survival instinct doesn't work. And now to allude to chapter 3 of this video, or 2, once again, cannot do math. A lot of times when people develop traits that later become survival instincts because they're successful for them, they usually are great assets for the person when they're currently going through the trauma. But when they leave the trauma and when they're no longer being traumatized or actively in contact with what was traumatizing them, then those survival instincts are no longer useful because your body's still acting like you're undergoing this incredibly stressful period of time when you're not. And so it can actually be incredibly harmful for you or for the people around you who you're imposing these survival instincts on. And it is important to note here that a lot of times when people are imposing these survival instincts on other people, which can lead to intergenerational trauma, it is coming from a genuine place of care, and it's not something that they do with malicious intent, because in their eyes they're like, oh, I survived by doing this, and so I know you can survive if you do this too. But they fail to recognize that the conditions that force them to be that way don't currently exist. And so, like I said earlier, I think here when we see Abuela Alma act this way and treat Bruno this way, in her mind she might be seeing it as, oh, this is better for the rest of my family and more of a greater good sort of situation. And I think it's safe to assume that she probably did try to get Bruno to not upset people or act a certain way, and then when he realized that he just couldn't do that, he left and she didn't say anything about it. So I do think that she did attempt to kind of get him to conform to her way of being safe, but at the end of the day when he couldn't do that, she kind of left him on his own because I assume, and all of this is my assumption, this entire video, except for like the plot points, that at least if she can't keep him safe, she can at least keep the rest of her family safe. Now with that being said, let's look at the next generation of the Madrigal family. However, let's start with the youngest triplets' kids, Pepa's kids. Now Dolores is the oldest of Pepa's kids. And she has the gift of super hearing. She knows everything that's happening in the house, yet through her speech and the way she acts, she's the quietest member of the Madrigal family, which is very ironic. She can hear everything as though everything is super loud, but yet she is super quiet. Even her vocal register is quite low and quite soft, and she speaks softly, and the only time we ever hear her reveal intimate details is when she hears Mirabel confess to her father about the destruction of the casita and therefore the family. And so it's plausible to say that maybe she only ever reveals secrets and the intimate details that she hears when she genuinely believes that her family is in danger. And I know it can be argued here that she did mention that Luisa's eye was twitching all night, but I also think it's safe to say that that wasn't really a secret. Luisa wasn't really keeping it under the wraps, but she knew that Mirabel's conversation with her father was supposed to be secret, because we do have a scene in that movie that clearly displays that. And I think through her we can see the trauma response of a child developing the mechanisms to have to be like a therapist for the rest of the family. That is, she lends an ear to all, but having nobody to share her own concerns with. And this we can see through her feelings about Isabel marrying the man of her dreams, that she only ever kind of alludes to during We Don't Talk About Bruno, where she says Bruno foresaw that the man of her dreams would be just out of reach and betrothed to another. Okay, I'm not singing no more. But we never really hear her say anything else about Mariano, and her lyrics in We Don't Talk About Bruno seem more empathetic towards Bruno's situation rather than critical. She's the only person who doesn't seem to be criticizing what he said or the way he presents himself at, and instead seems to ask Mirabel to consider how difficult his power is and what a burden it is on him. And she knows that it's a heavy lift with a gift so humbling, always leave Abuela and the family fumbling with prophecies that they couldn't understand. Do you understand? Yes, I'm quoting the song. That part wasn't me quoting the song though. She says this as though she understands it and the weight of it. And I think this way you can see that her hearing that is her gift forces her to kind of put herself in the shoes of others, because she's able to experience them at their most intimate moments when they're by themselves. She's the only Madrigal who knows that her uncle's in the walls of the house. And this is almost suggestive of the fact that she knows massive issues that are happening in the family, but she can't do anything as the family's therapist. And honestly, this point is pretty sad, but it's also kind of funny that she heard Bruno watching his telenovelas through the walls. I wonder what that sounded like. Were the mice just squeaking? Like how I assumed here that the rats would be acting. Now next is Camilo, and he's the middle kid out of the three children and the family jokester, and he possesses the gift to be able to shapeshift into any other person. And we see him primarily use this gift to act like the family jokester, to cheer people up, to joke around, but mostly to focus on keeping the family's spirit up. And in one of Disney's character notes that I saw, the character designer wrote in the traits of Camilo that he doesn't seem to know who he is, which is what I think his gift beautifully illustrates. I think it does this by kind of showing that there's no tangible positive to Camilo's gift like there is for like Luisa's gift or the other's gift. So he uses his to create something positive, where he makes other people laugh, or he tries to help them by becoming them. But that beyond this and beyond his function in the family, he isn't really sure about who he is. And so he quite literally changes his skin to understand who he truly is, almost as if by doing that he'll actually be able to find himself. So for Camilo, I definitely do think his gift portrays his identity crisis and how he's unable to find himself, which I think can definitely happen when you're forced to live out a specific role in a family for most of your entire life until you end up becoming a teenager or even older and start questioning who you really are and whether or not you even enjoy that. I think Camilo, as a teenager, is in the prime age for such questioning. And now the youngest of the family, Antonio. And although he's still very young, I think he's only 5, we can still see the amount of pressure that's exerted on him by his family. For example, right before the gift ceremony, he's nervous, scared, anxious, and completely aware of the repercussions of what happens if he doesn't get his gift. And he knows this because of Mirabel and what's happening with her, and how he's seen how she's treated and what happens to her as a Madrigal without a gift. But even when he's nervous, he seems to reach out towards her, the only member of his family who doesn't outwardly remind him of the pressure he faces because she doesn't have a gift, and asks her to walk with him to the stairs that lead to Abuela, which according to everyone's reaction is like a scandalous thing. And perhaps he does this because he knows that she's the only one he can connect to without any true consequences happening. And so we see Antonio develops the gift of being able to talk to animals. But also one thing I found interesting is, although he's able to do this, we see that he only ever opens up to Mirabel. He doesn't open up to his family when they ask him how he's feeling or when they're wishing him good luck for the ceremony, and he doesn't open up to anyone else. And perhaps through these animals, he's able to find another channel because he can communicate with the animals, but he knows that nothing he says can ever go to his family members because they don't understand what the animals are saying. I think both Camilo and Antonio's gift kind of display their desire for connection, specifically a connection that they do not receive from their family, while Camilo does it by changing skin and becoming other people and perhaps connecting with them emotionally. Antonio does it by turning to animals, his only point of safety away from his family. And now for the oldest triplet, Julieta's kids. Now the oldest of the three is Isabela. She's the perfect golden child. She's beautiful, she's perfect in every sense. What we initially think her gift is, and even she initially thinks that it's only this, is her ability to create beautiful flowers. But we can see through her the trauma response of being forced to be perfect and a perfectionist. And we can see how Abuela Alma enforces this on her. There's even a scene when Dolores mentions Mariano talking about how he wants like a bunch of children. I don't remember how many kids specifically. Isabel gets nervous and flowers appear on her head. One of them is a different color. It's white. And we see Abuela Alma come and pick it off. And that's such a subtle scene of showing exactly what Isabela's function is in the family and what she strives to be, and how she's forced to live with the expectation that Abuela puts on her. She even agrees to marry Mariano, a man she has no interest in, due to her having to fulfill the role of the perfect child, the child that doesn't cause any problems for the family. And multiple times she tells Mirabel off for ruining the perfection that she's trying to portray, or the perfection of the family, even that she wants not a sound out of her. I'm not gonna sing, I couldn't even sing there. And she does this so that she can maintain this illusion of being absolutely perfect in the eyes of her family, and therefore uphold their expectations. And I think her annoyance towards Mirabel can be chalked up as this too. Mirabel's the only person in her family without a power, and Mirabel's her little sister, and through her she's able to see the freedom that she could possibly have by not having this power, by not being the perfect child. And so she may feel resentment towards her for the freedom that Mirabel gets to experience by not having these expectations placed on her. And we also see in the way this builds animosity between the two, with Isabela and Mirabel not really being close. And the only time when Isabel kind of violates her role of being perfect by really truly fighting with Mirabel, she produces a cactus, something that she's never produced before. And then we see that when she's able to be herself, her and Mirabel are able to bond, almost as though when she's able to grasp onto the freedom that she wants for so long and not have to be perfect and see her potential to achieve so much more than she's forced to, her and Mirabel actually get along. And I think Isabella's portrayal as being kind of like a Disney princess through her voice and her features and her beauty, and further adds to this symbol. Now next is everyone's favorite dancer, Luisa. Now Luisa's gift is super strength. She's a middle kid out of Julieta's 3 children, and her qualm is the most obvious out of anyone in her family because of the absolutely amazing song, Surface Pressure. She feels the pressure like a drip 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 that never stops. Whoa. Gotta stop singing songs. She feels incredibly restrained by her role, almost to the point where she fears she has no inherent value to her family unless she's productive through her gift. And also we're able to see how she's forced to take on the protector sibling role by making sure that her younger sister, Mirabel, never has to experience the immense pressure that she has to experience. Luisa measures herself against the productivity of her gift to such an extent that we see what happens when it begins to fail her. That is when her power begins to falter, how it makes her act erratic, strange, emotionally volatile, and we can see this through the scenes where she randomly bursts out in tears or starts whining and just seems to not be okay because she just doesn't know how to contend with the reality where she isn't productive and in her eyes valuable to her family. That is a reality without her gift, because without her gift, that is her super strength. Who really is she? Also, she's killer moves. Like those moves, that role, amazing. Amazing. Her ability to make the donkeys her backup dancers, 10 on 10. And now finally, our dear protagonist, Mirabel, the youngest of the 3. And the second and most dangerous madrigal for Abuela Alma, who constantly tells her to stay out of her way and keep to the shadows and not interrupt the other members of the family. What I think is interesting about Mirabel is while she doesn't have a gift, or at least an outright gift, she seems to be the only person in the family that everyone voluntarily opens up to. And I use the word voluntarily here because while Dolores does definitely act as a family therapist, a lot of people may not choose to open up to her because of the fact that they can't consent to whether or not she can hear them. But Mirabel, on the other hand, everyone can consent to whether or not they open up to her, which I also think is why she's the only person in the family who everyone sings directly to. And I know this part can seem contradictory because there are some scenes where the rest of the family members are singing together. That's in the part of We Don't Talk About Bruno, but where Mariano comes and they're setting the table, they all are singing together. But I think that's a second condition where the family sings. It's when they're trying to present that they're a close family, which is what they're trying to do before Mariano gets there. And I also think this is why, even during this period when they're singing together, it seems to be more anxious, scared, and all in all, like a warding, because they're all all singing about terrible things that Bruno's done to them or why they don't talk about Bruno. The only time we see them sing openly when they're not singing to Mirabel is at the end of the movie when they're all singing together, happily, that they've all been reunited. And this includes Bruno, and that's actually the only time we hear Bruno sing, which can add to this that they sing when they feel comfortable and peaceful and safe. And all of them sound so much happier in the final number than they do in We Don't Talk About Bruno. And I also think Mirabel's character design also shows the amount of trust and unity her family feel when they're around her, since she's the only member of the family whose clothing includes a color of each member of her family's clothing. In the character of Mirabel, we can see the manifestation of someone trying to break out of the cyclical nature of intergenerational trauma and the repercussions that they face while doing so. The repercussions being how Abuela Alma discards Mirabel's worries about Casita falling apart, even though she's fully aware that it's actually happening. Also Casita falling apart and being completely destroyed, and how Mirabel feels after that, and then also the family candle temporarily blowing out. Through all of these events, we see Mirabel having to grapple with the fact that her efforts to mend the family are met with a lot of opposition through the literal house falling apart, or her family members trying to keep the family together and failing, and also through the loss or decrease in the potency of the family members' gifts. But we can also see how deeply Mirabel cares about her family through all of her actions and how hard she tries to keep them together, but how inevitably her actions lead to their harm because they don't initially listen to her, and so when her and Abuela begin to fight, Casita falls apart completely. Casita here being a symbol for their family. Again, when Casita is falling apart, we see Mirabel literally risk her life to try to get the candle, which symbolizes the family bonds here, and keep it burning. Also, when she realizes what's happening to her uncle Bruno, she tries to reintroduce him into the family and help him. When she recognizes that Abuela Alma's actions are of someone not malicious, but someone who's been deeply hurt, she approaches her with empathy and tries to understand her point of view instead of admonishing her. Perhaps Mirabel's real gift is not something tangible, but instead is the ability to heal the fraying threads of her family, and therefore eventually Casita. I also think it's very important to note how Abuela Alma is not shown to be the villain in Mirabel's story, and that once Mirabel learns what happened to her grandma, she tries to help her instead of vilifying her. I think it's very necessary to show people like Abuela Alma not as villains but as great characters, because a lot of times their actions don't come from ill intent, but come from a deep place of care and fear and wanting to protect their families. And so inadvertently, through their attempt to help their families, they end up hurting their families. And this actually happens to a lot of older members in collectivist cultures who are trying to keep their family together, trying to keep their family safe, but instead, since they're not able to unlearn their survival instincts that are not helpful in this situation, they end up hurting their family. People like Abuela Alma who've been through horrible, traumatizing, debilitating experiences in their youths exist. And when such trauma and such pain is left unchecked, a lot of times it manifests in ways that are not necessarily helpful to the person or to the people around them. This is an element that I think is very important about Encanto. There's no villain in Encanto. Unlike most Disney movies, Encanto does not have a villain, and its only person who can kind of be seen as the person causing the conflict, that is Abuela Alma, is someone who's a gray character. Because sure, their actions are hurting the people in their family, but they're not inherently a bad person. They're just someone who deeply needs love and needs to heal. And this truly is the beauty of Encanto, how there's no villain in the story, because similarly to real life, often our family members who end up hurting us, often, not always, are not genuinely bad people, but are just people who hurt themselves, and therefore exist more as a gray character instead of the very stark black and white of bad and good. Encanto tells a beautiful tale of how we feel pain and how it must be shared and addressed in order for us to heal as a family. Oftentimes, hurt people hurt people, and what I loved about the Madrigal family is how through their story, we're able to learn how to extend empathy and sympathy towards those who are clearly hurting in our own families. Again, this kind of adds on the extent of the harm that's inflicted. I'm not trying to excuse terrible behavior or abuse here at all, and I apologize if it sounds like I am. But additionally, in this way, it makes every family member seem deeply important to the intricate tapestry of their familial bonds. And it also displays the many different ways trauma manifests in people. It does not always look the same, and also it shows different ways in which trauma travels through people. And I think it's the qualities I just mentioned that make this movie deeply relatable to people who are Colombian, people outside of Colombia, people in other Latin American countries, people from immigrant families, people from families from collectivist cultures, or just people who are able to see their own families in the family members of the Madrigal family. I just said family so many times there. While the ending of Encanto tied together the loose threads of pain that each character's trauma caused in a very typical, easily wrapped, happy ever after fashion, what mattered was how the family was able to strengthen even more after they resolved their conflict and after they brought back Bruno to their family and Abuela Alma actually addressed the cause of her pain. Important how the movie showed that they were able to rebuild their community only after they resolved all these conflicts, and Abuela Alma welcomed Bruno back home and also opened herself up to her family and kind of let go of her victim style of coping with her own trauma. She was able to let go of her survival mode and recognize that she no longer needed those techniques to be able to live through the world that she currently was in, and that it wasn't benefiting Encanto or her family for her to act like this. And I think this is what makes Encanto such a wonderful addition to Disney's efforts of making diverse, culturally rich stories that narrate experiences that are shared by those who exist out of its typical prince, princess, cookie cutter formula. Through Encanto's incorporation of Colombia's rich history, magical realism that the country is so popular for in its literature, accurate portrayal of ethnicities, and a story displaying the importance of a family healing through metaphors that are digestible to so many, even accessible to children. And in conclusion, this is what I believe makes the movie Encanto so very different. And I also want to really stress on the fact that I'm not trying to excuse any possibly abusive behavior that Abuela Alma showed. Her survival mechanisms were not healthy and were not good for the family, so I'm not trying to justify them. I'm just trying to empathize and sympathize, you know? Especially since I think a lot of people who come from families that experience similar things don't necessarily always hate the person causing them, especially when you're able to learn about why they did that. And that's why I think it's really important that she's a gray character instead of a villain. Obviously, abuse cannot be excused, and I'm not at all trying to make excuses for it, but I just wanted to put that out there. So I hope I dispelled any worries about that fact. Woo! Okay, we finished that video. Ugh, that was so long. That was so much. This is gonna be so much to edit. Next, this video is probably really long, so thank you so much for watching. Also, thank you so much for watching my video out of everyone's video on this huge, endlessly growing website. And I also wanted to give a quick shout out to everyone who followed me recently. Thank you so much. The last time I uploaded a video, I had 5 subscribers, and now I have 32 subscribers, which is, oh my god, we could form a little Encanto village of our own. But yes, thank you so much for subscribing to me and for all the really nice comments that everyone left on my poetry video. It was so encouraging. Thank you so much for that. And once again, like equals to you growing potentially closer to be able to doing a body roll as well as Luisa. As always, it's very encouraging if you'd subscribe, and feel free to leave a comment below if you feel like I got something wrong or you have anything else to add to this conversation. I really like the comments I've been getting so far because I feel like a lot of them are super insightful and I'm able to learn even more about a subject I clearly am interested in. So please feel free to do that if you have more to say, or if you just like to send more motivation my way, that would also be totally welcomed. And I will see you all next week, hopefully, if this doesn't take forever to edit. Also, Mitski's new album's coming out next week, so I don't know who I'm going to be. I'm probably going to be going through a myriad of emotions, all of them bad. So that will be exciting, and I will see you next week. Goodbye!